Hello friends, welcome to the HFY Ode, where we bring you new science fiction stories, a new world, a new adventure. And yes, there is no robotic or AI voices here, only real human voices with real human touch. So let's start this journey, and please subscribe my channel if you like the stories and press the bell icon for the latest updates. Let's have a story. Okay.
They didn't even bring real weapons to guard us. That's the part nobody believes when I tell it. Just stun batons, crowd control mesh, the kind of gear you'd use on rowdy teenagers, not on people they were planning to march off a transport ship and sell by the kilo. I was standing in the third row of the holding pen on Calyx Station when it happened, and I want you to understand something before I go any further. I wasn't expecting a miracle. None of us were. We'd stopped expecting anything weeks before. You reach a point when you're a prisoner being shipped between systems where hope stops being a comfort and starts being a wound you keep poking at for no reason. So you let it go. You just exist. You watch the floor. You count the rivets in the wall plating, because counting is the only thing your brain will let you do that doesn't hurt. That's where I was, counting rivets. And then the ceiling came apart. I should back up, tell you where we were, who we were, because none of this makes sense without that part. My name doesn't matter much to this story. Call me Eshin if you need something to call me. I'm Velkari. We're not a warrior people. Never have been. We build things mostly. Beautiful things, lattice cities that breathe with the tide, music that you feel in your sternum before you hear it in your ears. We weren't built for war, and we never pretended otherwise. When the slavers came through our system 11 years ago, we didn't have a navy that could stop them. We had trade ships, cargo haulers, a handful of patrol cutters that were better suited to chasing off pirates than fighting an actual incursion fleet. So when the Skarn Compact rolled in with their boarding cruisers, it wasn't a battle, it was a harvest. They took the coastal cities first, then the orbital ring. By the time anyone outside our system even heard a distress signal had gone out, 500,000 of us were already in transport holds, freight classed like livestock, shipped out toward whatever market still bought biologicals. I'd been in that hold 8 months when we made our last stop. Calyx Station, a transfer point out past what the old star charts call the Thessaly Drift, a nothing system, gray and tired, mostly known for its refueling docks and the fact that nobody who didn't have to be there ever was. The Skarn weren't cruel in the cinematic way you'd expect. That's the thing people get wrong when they imagine slavers. They didn't whip us or make speeches about our inferiority. It was worse than that somehow. It was administrative. We were inventory. They fed us enough to keep the meat from spoiling and moved us through processing like crates on a belt, and the indifference of it, the sheer bureaucratic boredom of being someone's product line, that's what breaks you faster than cruelty ever could. There were maybe 300 of us in that holding pen on Calyx. Velkari mostly, but also a cluster of Dorith from 2 systems over, blue-skinned and silent, and a dozen or so Isat traders who'd been unlucky enough to be in port when the Skarn raided their relay station. Different species, same rivets to count. The guards rotated in shifts, 6 of them on the pen at any time, 2 more up in the observation gantry. Like I said, stun batons, mesh restraints, nothing heavier. Why would they need anything heavier? We weren't fighters, none of us. The whole galaxy out past the Thessaly Drift had learned over centuries the hard arithmetic of who could fight back and who couldn't, and we were solidly in the second category. The Skarn had run this route 100 times. They knew the math. What they didn't know was that the math had just changed. It started small. That's how I remember it anyway, small and wrong, in a way I couldn't name yet. One of the guards, a broad-shouldered Skarn named, I only know this because I heard the others say it later, Talvith, was leaning against the gantry rail scrolling through something on his wrist display. Bored. The way you get bored on a shift you've worked 1,000 times. And then his display chimed. Not loud, not dramatic, just a chime, the kind that means incoming priority traffic, and I watched him glance down at it the way you'd glance at a notification you expect to be nothing. His face changed. I want to be precise about this because precision matters when you're describing the moment your whole life turned a corner. It wasn't fear, not yet. It was confusion. The kind of confusion that comes before fear, when something doesn't fit the shape it's supposed to fit. He said something to the other guard on the gantry, sharp, fast, in Scarn tongue, which none of us spoke, but you don't need language to read alarm in a posture. The second guard came over. They both stared at the display like it had personally insulted them. Then the lights in the holding bay flickered. Not out, just flickered. A half-second stutter, the kind you get from a power surge. Except Calyx Station's grid hadn't surged in the 8 months I'd been moving through Scarn transfer points. Because slaver stations run lean and mean and don't have surges. They have redundancies stacked on redundancies because their whole business model depends on nothing ever going wrong in a way that lets the cargo get ideas. The lights flickered again, longer this time. Around me in the pen, I felt 300 people go very, very still. You learn in captivity to read a room the way prey animals read a field. Something was wrong, and wrong was dangerous, because in our experience, wrong for the Scarn usually meant worse for us. A malfunction meant a delay. A delay meant they'd heard us somewhere else to wait. Waiting meant standing in worse conditions for longer. I didn't think for 1 second that the wrongness might be good news. I want you to understand that. I didn't dare. The Doroth woman next to me, I never learned her name. We weren't exactly doing introductions, gripped my forearm. Her hand was shaking. I remember that detail with strange clarity, the tremor in her fingers, because it was the first physical thing that told me something enormous was happening before my mind had caught up. "Listen," she whispered. Her translator collar was cracked, half its function gone, so the word came out flat and mechanical. "Listen." I listened. At first there was nothing. Just the hum of the station's life support, the low murmur of 300 frightened people trying not to be heard, the occasional crackle from the guards' comm units. Then I heard it, a vibration, low and deep, traveling up through the floor, plating into the soles of my feet, like something enormous moving somewhere far below us, or far above. It's hard to tell direction through structural resonance when you've never felt anything like it before. Talvith was shouting into his comm now, not bored anymore. The other gantry guard had drawn his stun baton, which made no sense. What was he going to do, baton the station's hull? But I understood the gesture even if the logic didn't track. It was the gesture of someone reaching for the only tool they had because their hands needed to be doing something. The vibration got stronger. And then, without any warning that I could perceive, the lights went out completely. Darkness in a holding pen is a specific kind of darkness. It's not peaceful. 300 people who have spent months learning to be quiet suddenly have a reason to be loud. And the sound that went up around me, it wasn't screaming, not at first. It was worse than screaming. It was that low collective moan of pure animal uncertainty. The sound a herd makes right before it decides whether to bolt. Emergency lighting kicked in a few seconds later, dim red strips along the floor, just enough to see silhouettes and not faces. In that red half-light I saw Talvith fumbling with something on his belt. A sidearm, I think, something heavier than the stun baton, which told me, even before anything else happened, that whatever was coming, he didn't think a crowd control baton was going to be enough for it. That scared me more than the dark had. The vibration kept building. It wasn't subtle anymore. I could feel it in my teeth. Someone near the back of the pen, an Issat trader, I think. One of the ones who'd been quietly praying in his own tongue for the better part of an hour, suddenly went silent mid-word, and I followed his gaze upward, toward the ceiling of the holding bay, and that's when I saw the first crack of light. Not station light. Outside light, a hairline seam glowing white-hot, tracing itself across the ceiling plating in a shape too clean to be an accident, too precise to be damage. Something was cutting through the hull from outside. The guards were screaming orders now, real fear in their voices. the kind that doesn't care about dignity anymore. Talvith raised his sidearm toward the ceiling, which was the single most pointless gesture I have ever witnessed a person make, pointing a weapon at a problem that was already inside the building's structural integrity, already past the point where pointing things at it mattered. The seam closed into a circle. The circle dropped. I need you to picture this the way I saw it, because the angle matters. I was on the floor of the pen on my knees, because everyone around me had gone down instinctively the second the ceiling started glowing. That ancient prey-animal logic of make yourself small when the sky does something you don't understand. So I was looking up through a forest of legs and shaking bodies, up at a ceiling that had just opened like a wound, up at a perfect black circle of starlight where solid metal used to be. And out of that circle, in dead silence, no engine roar, no thrusters, nothing, just gravity and intent, 4 shapes fell. They didn't fall like things falling. That's the detail I can't get past, even now, even telling it again. Things that fall wrong. They tumble, they flail, gravity does what it does to objects that aren't built to manage it. These shapes fell like they'd made an appointment with the floor and were simply, calmly keeping it. They hit the deck in a crouch. All 4, simultaneous, like a single thought split into 4 bodies. The impact cracked the floor plating beneath them. I heard it, a sound like ice breaking, and a wave of red emergency light caught their silhouettes for just long enough that every single person in that pen saw the same thing at the same moment. Armor, matte black, no insignia I recognized, no markings that screamed any faction the Skarn would have a file on. Helmets with a single horizontal visor slit, dark, reflecting the red light back like a held breath. And they were not large. That's what struck me first, oddly. I'd built up some expectation, in the half-second of falling debris and screaming, that whatever came through that ceiling would be huge, towering, the kind of thing that announces its power through sheer mass. They weren't huge. They were human-sized, smaller than the Skarn guards even. It didn't matter. The moment they rose out of that crouch, unhurried, deliberate, every Skarn guard in the room had their weapon up and shaking. For 3 full seconds, and I counted them, I actually counted, some part of my brain still doing what it had been trained to do for 8 months, even as the rest of me was unraveling, nothing happened. The 4 figures stood. The guards aimed. The pen held its breath. Then Talvith fired. I saw the shot. A bright lance of energy, point blank, dead center on the nearest figure's chest plate. The figure didn't move, didn't flinch, didn't stagger, didn't do anything at all except absorb the hit the way a wall absorbs a thrown stone, total, uninterested indifference. There was a flicker of light across the chest plate, gone in an instant, like the armor had simply declined the conversation. I have never, before or since, heard a room go as quiet as that holding pen went in the half-second after that shot. Talvith fired twice more. Same result. I watched his face shift through every stage of disbelief a person can move through in under 2 seconds, confusion, denial, and finally, right at the end, something that looked an awful lot like a man recognizing all at once that he had badly misjudged the geometry of his entire evening. The nearest figure tilted its helmet very slightly. A human gesture, somehow, even filtered through black armor and a closed visor. The universal small movement of someone looking at you and finding you mildly, almost gently, disappointing. Then it closed the distance. I won't pretend I saw the details cleanly. It happened too fast and I was on the floor, and panic does strange things to memory. What I remember is this. One moment the figure was 10 feet from Talvith, and the next moment Talvith was on the ground, weapon skidding away across the deck plating, and the figure was simply standing where he'd been standing, like it had teleported, except I knew, somewhere under the noise in my head, that it hadn't teleported at all. It had just moved faster than my eyes were built to track. The other 3 guards on the floor level scattered, not toward us, and I want to note that because it tells you something about what kind of guards they were, the kind who run from danger rather than toward the people they're supposed to be controlling. One of them made it 3 steps before going down, hit by something I never saw fired. The other 2 reached the blast door at the far end of the bay and started hammering the access panel, screaming for it to open. It didn't open for them. I'm not going to tell you the fight took long, because it didn't. I'm not going to dress it up as some grand clash either, because it wasn't that. It was fast and quiet and almost, and this is the word that's stuck with me for years now, almost polite. Like watching someone tidy a room they found in an unacceptable state. The 2 guards at the blast door were down within seconds of each other. The gantry guard, the one who'd drawn his baton like it would matter, never got the chance to use it. One of the 4 figures was simply standing on the gantry with him before he'd finished raising his arm, and then he wasn't standing at all. In the holding pen, 300 captive people had gone from screaming to a silence so total I could hear my own pulse in my ears. No one moved. No one dared make a sound. Whatever this was, it had just demonstrated in under a minute that it could end 6 armed Skarn guards without apparent effort. And none of us, not the Velkari, not the Doroth, not the Isat traders, had any framework for what that meant about our own immediate safety. Because here's the truth nobody likes to admit about being a captive. When something overwhelmingly powerful crashes into your captivity, your first feeling isn't hope. It's terror. A different terror, maybe. A terror with a different shape, but terror all the same. We didn't know if these things, whatever they were, considered us cargo too. We didn't know if we were about to change owners rather than change fates. So we stayed on the floor. We stayed quiet. We waited to find out what kind of monster had just killed our other monsters. One of the 4 figures crossed the floor toward the pen. Slow steps. Unhurried, the way you walk toward something you don't consider a threat, not because you're careless but because you've already calculated with total certainty that it isn't one. It stopped at the mesh barrier separating the pen from the open bay floor. Looked at us, or I assume it looked at us, behind that dark visor slit. There was no way to actually confirm where its attention was pointed, except that the posture, the stillness, the angle of the helmet, all of it added up to attention, focused and complete. Nobody breathed. I didn't breathe. I remember that specifically, holding air in my chest until it started to burn, because some animal part of my brain had decided that breathing was a risk I couldn't afford to take. Then it reached up and unsealed its helmet. The release hissed, a small mechanical sound that felt enormous in that silence. The helmet came away in the figure's hand, and underneath. A face, a human face. I didn't know what human meant yet, not really, not as a word with a species attached to it, but I knew immediately with total clarity that I was looking at a face built the way faces are built when evolution has spent a very long time arguing with itself about expression. Lines around the eyes. A jaw set somewhere between exhaustion and resolve. Skin a shade I'd never seen before, weathered, the kind of weathering that comes from a life that hasn't been gentle. The eyes were the part that undid me. Not because they were cold, I'd braced for cold, for the kind of distant predator's gaze you'd expect from something that had just ended 6 lives without visible effort. They weren't cold. They were tired. Tired in a specific, recognizable way, the way you look when you've done a hard thing too many times and you're doing it again anyway because somebody has to. The figure, the man, I should say, because that's what he was, plainly, unmistakably, scanned the pen. 300 frightened faces. Then he said something. I didn't understand the words, not at first. My translator collar was struggling with whatever language pattern it was parsing, lagging 2-3 seconds behind. But the tone needed no translation. It was gentle. After everything I just watched him do, after watching him walk through armed guards like they were furniture in his way, his voice, when he finally spoke, came out gentle, like he was talking to something he was afraid of startling. My collar caught up half a beat later, stuttering the translation into my ear. "It's all right," he said. "We're not here to take anything from you." He paused, looked around the pen again, at the cracked translator collars, the mesh restraints biting into wrists, 300 people who'd forgotten, somewhere over the last 8 months, what it felt like to be looked at as anything other than inventory. "We're here," he said, "because somebody finally heard you." I'd like to tell you that the whole pen erupted in joy right then. That's how it would go in the stories, isn't it? The rescue, the relief, the tears of gratitude, all in one clean beat. That's not what happened. What happened was slower and stranger and, I think, more honest. What happened was that nobody moved for a long moment, because hope, when you've starved it for 8 months, doesn't come back all at once. It comes back in pieces, cautious pieces, the way feeling comes back into a limb that's gone numb, painful, almost, before it's any kind of relief. The Dorothy woman beside me let go of my arm. I felt the absence of her grip before I registered why. She was staring at the man with the unsealed helmet, and her mouth was moving, though no sound came out. And I understood in that moment that some of us simply did not have the capacity left to believe what we were seeing. Not yet. Not without more proof than one calm voice and 6 fallen guards. The man seemed to understand that too. He didn't push. He didn't demand celebration or even gratitude. He just stood there patient, while behind him the other 3 figures, I still hadn't seen their faces, helmets still sealed, moved methodically through the bay, securing the blast doors, checking the fallen guards, doing the unglamorous work that nobody puts in the stories. It was one of the Isat traders who broke first. An older one, gray-furred, who'd spent the entire transport quietly murmuring prayers under his breath whenever he thought no one could hear. He stood up, slowly, like his joints had forgotten how the motion worked, and he said something in his own language, something my collar translated half a beat too late, the words arriving thin and uncertain in my ear. "Are you real?" The man with the unsealed helmet, I'd learn his name soon enough, though I won't give it to you yet, because that's not how the story unfolded for me, and I want to tell it the way it actually happened, looked at the old trader for a long moment. "Yeah," he said, quiet, almost like he was asking himself the same question. "Yeah, we're real." I think that's the moment the dam actually broke. Not the rescue itself. The rescue had already happened mechanically, in the space of about 90 seconds of violence none of us fully understood. The dam broke on that small, plain answer to an old man's question. "Yeah, we're real." 4 words, no grand declaration, no speech about justice or vengeance or galactic order restored. Just a tired man confirming, gently, that he existed. The sound that went through the pen after that, I still don't have a good word for it. It wasn't cheering. It was something rower, messier, 300 different species making 300 different sounds of disbelief and relief and grief all tangled together, because relief, when it's big enough, always drags grief along behind it. Grief for the 8 months. Grief for the people who hadn't survived the transport. Grief for cities that weren't going to be unburned, just because the burning had, apparently, finally been noticed by someone with the power to do something about it. I was crying. I'll just say that plainly because there's no use pretending otherwise. I was on my knees on a cracked floor with restraint mesh still biting my wrists, and I was crying in a way I hadn't let myself do in 8 months, because crying in captivity is a luxury you can't always afford. It draws attention. It costs energy you don't have to spare. You learn to keep it folded up small inside you, and when the lid finally comes off, it doesn't come off gently. The man walked to the mesh barrier and tore it open with his bare hands. Not dramatically, no flourish, no show of strength for an audience. Just practical, efficient, the way you'd open a stuck door you happen to be strong enough to force. The mesh tore like wet paper, and for the first time in 8 months there was nothing standing between us and an open floor. Nobody rushed it. That's the part that still surprises me when I think back. 300 people, suddenly free of a barrier they'd been told was unbreakable, and almost no one moved right away. We just stared at the gap, like it might be a trick, like the cruelty of the last 8 months had trained something so deep into us that freedom itself had become suspicious. The man crouched down at the edge of the gap, bringing himself to eye level with those of us nearest the front. Up close, The tiredness in his face was even more obvious, not weakness. I understood even then, but the specific exhaustion of someone who'd been doing something difficult for a long, long time and intended to keep doing it. "Take your time," he said. "Nobody's going to make you move faster than you're ready to." It was the other three who finally got things moving. They'd finished securing the bay, guards restrained, not killed. I noticed with a strange jolt of surprise, because somewhere in the back of my mind I'd assumed killed. Assumed that kind of efficient violence only went one direction. But no. Talvith and the others were alive, bound, disarmed, slumped against the far wall under guard, and that detail told me something about the people who'd just torn through this station that I didn't have words for yet. One of the three came over and finally cracked her helmet seal. A woman this time, younger looking than the man, hair cropped short, a scar along her jaw that had clearly healed wrong at some point and never been fixed. She looked at the pen, at all of us still mostly frozen at the edge of the broken barrier, and she didn't say anything gentle. She just said, practical and clear, "We've got 2 more decks to clear before this station's secure. There's a transport in Bay 4 that'll take you somewhere safer than here. You don't have to decide anything right now except whether you want to start walking toward it." It was the plainness of it that did something to me. Not a speech, not a promise of glory or vengeance, just logistics, delivered like she trusted us to handle logistics, like she wasn't going to insult us by wrapping the moment in more emotion than we'd already supplied ourselves. I stood up. My legs didn't want to hold me. 8 months of bad nutrition and worse sleep had left them unreliable, but I stood, and I started walking, and around me slowly in 2s and 3s, the rest of the pen began to do the same. We didn't know yet what these people were. We didn't know where they'd come from, what had taken them so long, why a species we'd never even heard of had apparently decided that our system, our small, unimportant system out past systems that mattered, was worth the trouble of an armed incursion against the Skarn Compact. We didn't know that the Skarn had thought with absolute confidence that no one was coming for us, that the math had been settled for centuries. Slow species, quiet species, species without navies, were simply prey, and prey didn't get rescued, prey got harvested, and the harvesting continued forever because nobody with the power to stop it had ever cared enough to look. We didn't know that the math had just changed forever, and that we were standing in the wreckage of the moment it changed. All I knew, walking out of that holding pen on legs that barely worked, was that a man with tired eyes had looked at 300 frightened strangers and told them, without any flourish at all, that somebody had finally heard us. I didn't know his name yet. I didn't know what his people called themselves, what world they'd come from, what it had cost them to come this far for people who weren't theirs. But I knew, even then, even shaking, even crying, even barely able to walk, I knew that something had shifted in the galaxy that day. Something old and cruel and confident had just discovered the hard way that it had been wrong about who was watching. The transport smelled like metal and rain. I don't know how to explain the rain part. There was no rain on that ship, obviously. We were in a docking bay full of recycled air and old grease, and the ozone tang of plasma cutters still cooling somewhere behind us. But that's the smell my brain decided to file it under, and 8 years later it's still the smell I associate with the first time I felt safe. Strange, the things memory decides to keep. We walked up the ramp in a loose, uneven line. 300 people who'd spent 8 months learning to move in formation, because formation was safer than standing out, and now nobody was telling us how to walk, and half of us didn't know what to do with that freedom. Some people clustered close together. Some walked alone, arms wrapped around themselves like they were holding their own ribs in place. The Dorith woman who'd gripped my arm back in the pen was a few steps ahead of me now, walking next to one of her own people, the two of them not talking, just walking close enough that their shoulders brushed every few steps. At the top of the ramp, just inside the hold, more of them were waiting. Humans. I counted without meaning to, old habit, the counting, the same reflex that had me counting rivets back in the pen. 11 of them in lighter gear than the 4 who dropped through the ceiling, no helmets at all, faces open to the air. They moved through the crowd handing out water packs and thin silver blankets and saying things in voices pitched low and careful, the way you'd talk to something easily spooked. One of them, a woman maybe my own age, crouched down in front of me before I'd even fully registered she was there. She had a medical scanner in one hand and an expression that managed to be both professional and kind at the same time, which I hadn't realized was a combination a face could hold until I saw it. "Hey," she said. My collar caught the word with no lag this time. Whatever device they were using to push translation through our broken collars had apparently improved in the last few minutes. "You're safe. I just need to check you over, that okay?" I nodded. I don't think I could have spoken even if I'd wanted to. She ran the scanner along my arm, my collarbone, the side of my head where a guard had struck me 3 weeks earlier for moving too slowly through a checkpoint. Her jaw tightened when the scanner read that spot. Just slightly. A flicker, gone fast, like she'd caught herself reacting and reeled it back in, because reacting wasn't going to help me right now. "You're going to be okay," she said. "Malnutrition, some old bruising, nothing we can't fix. We'll get you proper food once we're moving." "Why," I managed, the first word I'd spoken since the ceiling opened. "Why did you come?" She looked at me for a second. Really looked, the way people rarely do, like she was actually deciding how to answer instead of reaching for something easy. "Because somebody screamed into the dark," she said, "and this time somebody heard it." I learned later that the somebody who'd screamed was a Velkari engineer named Das Enrethi, who I never met and who, as far as I know, didn't even survive the initial raid on our home system. He'd been part of the orbital ring's old relay network, civilian infrastructure, nothing military, built for shipping schedules and weather telemetry. And in the chaos of the Skarn boarding action, he'd done something almost suicidally pointless by any normal calculation. He diverted every scrap of power the relay station had left into a single tight beam distress burst, aimed not at the nearest friendly system, because there wasn't one close enough to matter, but at a set of old coordinates buried in a deep archive nobody had touched in decades. Coordinates for a species most of the galaxy considered, at best, an interesting historical footnote. A species that had gone quiet a long time ago, retreated behind its own borders, and was widely assumed to have either died out or simply stopped caring what happened outside its own small slice of space. He sent the signal anyway, because it was the only frequency left in the archive that hadn't already been flagged as monitored and ignored by the Skarn's jamming nets. Because when you're drowning and every door is locked, you bang on the one door nobody's bothered to guard, even if you don't believe anyone's behind it. Nobody on our side ever expected an answer. I want to be honest about that. When the story of Das Enrethi's signal eventually made its way around the survivors, and it did in pieces, traded between people in low voices over the following weeks, most of us heard it the same way, as a sad footnote. A brave, useless gesture sent by a man who probably died within the hour into a void that had no reason to answer. Except it did answer, just not in the way anyone expected, and not in the time anyone expected, and that's its own piece of the story, one that took me longer to understand than the rest. The transport detached from Calyx Station about 20 minutes after the last survivor was aboard. I felt it in my stomach more than I heard it, a low shudder, then a kind of weightless drop that several people near me responded to with audible distress, having never experienced anything like real spaceflight before, only the rough, jolting transit of Skarn cargo holds. A man's voice came over the ship's comm a few minutes later, and I recognized it immediately, the same voice from the pen, the one that had told an old Issat trader plainly that he was real. "This is Calder," the voice said. "Some of you might have seen me back on the station. I want to keep this simple because I know simple is what most of you have the energy for right now, so here's what's happening. We're moving you to a relief station 2 systems over. It's not fancy. It's safe. There's food, there's medical staff, there's people whose whole job right now is making sure you're not scared anymore. Once we're there, anyone who wants to talk about what happened to you can talk to someone. Anyone who doesn't want to talk doesn't have to. Nobody's going to make you relive this faster than you're ready to. A pause. I remember the pause specifically because it felt deliberate, the kind of pause a person takes when they're deciding whether to say something extra, something not strictly necessary. I know you don't know us, he said. I know trusting people you've just met after what's been done to you isn't easy and it shouldn't be easy, and nobody on this ship is going to ask you to pretend otherwise. Just take the time you need. That's all I've got. We'll be in transit about 6 hours. The comm clicked off. Around me, the hold was quiet in a different way than it had been quiet in the pen, not the brittle silence of fear, but something looser, exhausted, like a held breath finally let go in pieces. I didn't sleep on that transport. I tried. My body wanted it badly enough that my eyes kept sliding shut on their own, but every time they did, something in me jerked back awake, Chinese letter animal vigilance that 8 months of captivity had carved so deep into my nervous system that it didn't care the danger was gone. So instead I sat with my back against a bulkhead, wrapped in the silver blanket the medic had given me, and I watched. There was a lot to watch. The humans moved through the hold all through those 6 hours, never in a hurry, never performing anything for an audience. I watched the medic. Her name was Priya. I learned eventually, though it took her 3 more conversations before she offered it, like she understood that names were a kind of intimacy some of us weren't ready for yet, work her way down a row of ISAT traders, checking each one in turn, occasionally crouching to talk quietly with someone who needed more than a scan. I watched one of the soldiers, a heavy-set man with a beard going gray at the edges, sit on the floor next to a Velkari child who'd been separated from her parents somewhere during the chaos of boarding the transport months ago, and had been quietly, persistently terrified ever since. He didn't try to comfort her with words. I don't think he had any that would have crossed the language gap cleanly enough to matter to a frightened child. He just sat near her, not touching, not crowding, and after a while he pulled a small multi-tool from his belt and started disassembling and reassembling it, slow and methodical, the kind of repetitive motion that's almost hypnotic to watch. After about 10 minutes, she'd shuffled close enough to watch over his shoulder. After 20, she was asking him questions in her own language that he couldn't understand a word of, and he was answering anyway in his own language, neither of them understanding the other and both of them, somehow, having an actual conversation. I watched Calder, the man from the pen, walk the length of the hold twice during those 6 hours, not talking much, just present, occasionally crouching to check on someone, occasionally saying something low to one of his own people. He had the bearing of someone who carried weight he didn't put down often, but he also had a way of making himself smaller around the survivors, shoulders dropped, voice pitched soft, like he understood instinctively that everything about his presence, his strength, the violence we'd all witnessed him capable of, needed to be managed carefully around people who just spent months being hurt by people who were also strong. It was during his second pass through the hold that he ended up crouched near me again. "You're the one who asked why," he said, not unkindly, just observing. I did. You get an answer that made sense. I thought about it, about Das and Rethi and his signal into the dark, about old coordinates and a species everyone assumed had stopped caring. Not really, I admitted. Why would anyone come this far, for people they've never heard of, for a system that doesn't matter to anyone? Calder was quiet for a moment. When he answered, he didn't look at me, he looked past me, toward the far end of the hold, where the heavy-set soldier was still sitting with the Velkari child and her multi-tool conversation. "You ever hear of something happening to people you love," he said, "and you weren't there and you couldn't have been there and it still feels like your fault somehow, not because it was, just because you're built to feel that way?" I nodded slowly. "My species spent a long time not looking outward," he said, Long story, not all of it good. There was a stretch where we figured the rest of the galaxy's problems weren't ours to carry, and we had enough problems of our own to justify believing that. And then a signal came through, from a system most of our analysts had never heard of, sent by someone who must have known the odds of anyone answering were close to nothing. He paused. And somebody on our end looked at that signal and said, "What if we're wrong about not looking?" "That's it," I asked. One person changed their mind. One person changed their mind out loud, in front of people who could do something about it, Calder said. That's usually how it starts. Doesn't take everyone agreeing at once. Just takes enough of the right people deciding the old answer isn't good enough anymore. He stood, knees cracking audibly, and gave me a small, tired smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. Not because it was false. I understood even then. But because there wasn't enough left in him that day for a smile to reach all the way. "We're not here because your system matters more than other systems," he said. "We're here because somebody finally asked the question of whether it mattered at all, and the only honest answer anybody could give was yes. It always mattered. We just weren't listening before." It took me a while to learn the rest of it, not from Calder, who I think genuinely didn't enjoy talking about his own people's history, but from Priya, the medic, during one of the quieter stretches of that 6-hour transit, when she'd finished her rounds and ended up sitting near me with a ration bar she clearly wasn't planning to eat herself. "We weren't always like this," she said, when I finally worked up the nerve to ask the question Calder had sidestepped. What were they exactly, this species that fell out of the sky with no warning and tore apart an entrenched slaving operation in under 2 minutes? "Earth, that's our homeworld. We had a rough few centuries. Wars, bad ones. The kind that make a species look inward for a long time afterward. Because looking outward feels like a luxury you can't afford when you're still cleaning up the mess at home." "How long is a long time?" I asked. "Couple 100 years, give or take, before we really started moving out into the wider galaxy in any serious way." She tore a corner off the ration bar, didn't eat it, just turned it over in her fingers. Long enough that by the time we did start showing up out here, most of the galaxy had already decided what the map looked like without us in it. Empires had already drawn their lines. Trade routes had already been carved up. Species like the Skarn had already built whole economies on the assumption that nobody was coming to check their math. "And then you checked it." "And then we checked it," she agreed. "Slowly, at first. We're not, I want to be honest with you because I think you deserve honesty more than you deserve a good story right now. We're not some galaxy-spanning power that swept in to fix everything. We're still small out here compared to a lot of what's out there. What we are is stubborn, and we don't forget things easily. And somewhere along the way enough of us decided that finding people like you, people who'd been written off as too small or too quiet or too far away to be worth saving, was worth being stubborn about." I sat with that for a while. Out past the hull, invisible to me but present in some abstract sense I couldn't quite shake, was the wreckage of Calyx Station receding behind us. 6 Skarn guards bound and left for whatever authority Calder's people intended to hand them over to. 300 lives that had been inventory an hour ago and were, somehow in the space of that hour, people again. "How many systems have you done this for?" I asked. "Before mine." Priya's face did something complicated. Not pride, exactly. Something more like the particular tiredness of someone carrying a number that was both an accomplishment and a wound at the same time. "Enough that it's not the first time," she said. "Not nearly enough that it feels like enough. There's always another system, another signal somebody almost didn't send, another group of people who'd already given up on anyone coming." She looked at me then, steady, no flinching in it. "That's the part that doesn't get easier. Knowing how many we're too late for. Knowing how many we haven't even found the signal for yet because it's still out there, unanswered in some dark relay nobody's checked. But you keep going." "We keep going," she said, "because the alternative is deciding some lives matter less than others based on geography, And once you start doing that math, there's no good place to stop. Somewhere around the 4th hour of transit, the heavyset soldier, his name, I'd learn, was Dunmore, came over and sat near a cluster of us. The Velkari child from earlier now asleep against his side, the multi-tool tucked back into his belt. He didn't say anything for a long while, just sat, the kind of comfortable silence that doesn't ask anything of the people sharing it. It was the old Isat trader, the one who'd asked Calder if he was real, who finally broke the silence. He'd recovered some of his composure in the hours since the rescue, enough that his voice came out steadier when he spoke. "Your friend," he said, nodding toward where Calder stood near the hold's far bulkhead, deep in quiet conversation with 2 of the other soldiers. "He carries something heavy. I have seen that look before, on people who have lost more than they say." Dunmore glanced over at Calder, then back at the old trader, and something in his expression shifted, careful, considering, the look of a man deciding how much of someone else's story belongs to him to tell. "He lost his sister," Dunmore said finally, quiet enough that I had to lean in to catch it through my collar's translation. "Years back, different system before I knew him. Story goes they got the signal too late, found the colony but there wasn't anybody left to rescue." He paused. "He doesn't talk about it, but I think that's why he's the one who always wants to go through the door first when we get close enough to think we might still be in time." The old trader nodded slowly, like something had been confirmed that he'd already half suspected. "Grief makes some people smaller," he said, "and makes others into doors that open for strangers." Dunmore didn't have an answer for that. He just looked over at Calder again, at the careful, deliberate way he moved through a hold full of frightened survivors, like every gesture was a small apology for a war that wasn't his fault but felt like it anyway. I thought about Das and Rethi then, a man I never met, who almost certainly died within the hour of sending his signal, who couldn't have known whether anyone would ever hear it, who sent it anyway because the alternative was silence, and silence in that moment must have felt like its own kind of surrender. I thought about how his signal had crossed who knows how many light years of empty dark, into the hands of people who'd built their whole identity, in the years since their own grief, around the idea that somebody always has to be listening. And I thought, for the first time since the ceiling opened on Calyx Station, that maybe this wasn't luck. Maybe it was something closer to inevitability, not because the universe owed us rescue, but because somewhere out in that dark, a species that had learned its own hard lessons about loss had decided, collectively, stubbornly, that no signal would go unanswered again if they had anything to say about it. The relief station, when we finally reached it 6 hours later, didn't look like much from the outside. A squat, unglamorous structure orbiting a gas giant nobody had bothered to name anything more poetic than a catalog number. But when the transport doors opened, the air that hit us was warm, and it smelled like actual food cooking somewhere, and there were more humans waiting on the dock, along with, and this caught me by surprise, other species too. A pair of Doroth in civilian dress, clearly survivors of some earlier rescue, standing near the entrance with blankets and quiet smiles, there, specifically, I'd learn, to greet new arrivals who needed to see a familiar face that wasn't human, someone who'd walked this exact road before them. I stepped off that transport on legs that still didn't quite trust the ground, into a warm orbital station full of strangers who'd apparently made it their life's work to make sure no signal ever went unanswered again. And I understood, in a way I hadn't fully understood back in the holding pen, that something had genuinely changed. The Skarn had built an empire on a simple, confident piece of math, that the galaxy's quiet, distant, undefended peoples would always stay quiet, distant, and undefended, because nobody powerful enough to matter would ever bother to check. They just learned, in the worst possible way, that the math had an error in it. A small, stubborn, grieving species out past their own old borders had decided, one signal at a time, that the equation needed solving for a different answer. And as I walked into that warm station, surrounded by 300 people who were, slowly, cautiously, starting to believe they were actually safe, I thought about Calder's tired eyes and Priya's honest, uncomfortable accounting of how many they were still too late for, and Dunmore's quiet grief passed second-hand through a stranger's careful words. I didn't know yet what it would cost them to keep doing this. I didn't know how many more Calyx stations were still out there, how many more Das and Rethas were sending signals into the dark with no guarantee anyone would ever hear them. But I knew, walking into that station, that the Skarn's confidence, the bone-deep certainty that had let them build a slaving empire on the assumption that no one was coming, had just met something it had never accounted for. It had met people who'd already lost too much to let it happen to anyone else, if they could possibly help it. I spent 11 days at that relief station before anything else happened. I want to start there with the slow part, because I think people skip past the slow part too easily when they tell stories like this, and the slow part is where most of the actual healing happens, not in the dramatic rescue, in the 11 boring, ordinary days after it. I learned the names of people I'd shared a holding pen with for 8 months and never once spoken to, because speaking had been dangerous and silence had been survival. I learned that the Dorith woman who'd gripped my arm in the dark was named Vethka, and that she had 2 sons back home she didn't yet know the fate of, and that she cried herself to sleep most nights not from fear anymore, but from the unbearable, suspended not knowing. I learned that the old Issat trader's name was Coram, and that he'd been a minor relay administrator before the raid, nothing important, just a man who fixed signal equipment for a living, and that he found a strange, quiet comfort in the fact that it had been exactly that kind of unimportant signal equipment, in the hands of a man much like himself, that had eventually brought us all here. The station had counselors, human ones mostly, but also a pair of Dorith survivors from an earlier rescue who understood things the humans, for all their kindness, couldn't quite reach. I talked to one of them eventually on the 9th day, and I won't pretend the conversation fixed anything. It didn't. But it was the first time since the raid that I said out loud, to another living person, the worst parts of what had happened to me, and something in my chest loosened slightly afterward, the way a knot loosens when you finally find the right end of the rope to pull. Calder and his unit weren't at the station most of those 11 days. I noticed their absence the way you notice an ache easing, not consciously, at first, just a slow recognition that something had changed in the texture of the place. Priya told me, the one time our paths crossed in the station's medical wing, that they'd shipped out 2 days after dropping us off, headed toward another distress signal that had come in from a system even further out than ours. Another Calyx station, I asked. Different system, similar story. She didn't elaborate further, and I understood by then that there was a kind of mercy in not elaborating, that for every rescue we got to hear about in full, there were others still unfolding, still uncertain and burdening survivors with that uncertainty before it resolved one way or another wasn't kindness. It was just weight with nowhere useful to land. It was on the 11th day that Calder came back, and he didn't come back alone. I was in the station's common hall when the transport docked, a wide, sun-warmed room with real windows looking out over the gas giant's slow amber clouds. The kind of room someone had clearly designed to make traumatized people feel less like they were still inside a metal box floating in the void. I'd taken to spending my afternoons there, partly because the light was good and partly because Vethka liked to sit near the windows too, and we developed an easy, mostly wordless companionship that didn't require either of us to perform recovery for the other. The door opened, and Calder walked in still in half his field gear, helmet under one arm, looking like a man who hadn't slept properly in days. Behind him came Dunmore, and the woman with the heel-drawn jaw scar I'd seen back on Calyx Station, and 6 or 7 others I didn't recognize. And behind all of them, walking slowly, supported between 2 of the soldiers, came people who were unmistakably, achingly, freshly rescued. thin, hollow-eyed, wrapped in the same silver blankets we'd been wrapped in 11 days earlier. Vethka went rigid beside me. I understood why immediately. Among the new arrivals were 2 Doroth, and one of them, a young man who couldn't have been more than 20 by Doroth reckoning, was looking around the unfamiliar hall with the exact same fragile, disbelieving expression we must all have worn 11 days ago. Vethka stood up so fast her chair scraped loud across the floor. The young Doroth man's head turned at the sound, and for a moment the two of them just stared at each other across the width of the hall, 2 strangers from the same species, separated by circumstance and the particular cruelty of distance, recognizing something in each other that needed no translation. "Is he?" I started. "I don't know him," Vethka said, voice tight. "But I know that look. I wore that look 11 days ago." She was already moving, crossing the hall toward him, and I watched her crouch down in front of the boy and start speaking low and fast in their own tongue, and I watched something in his shoulders begin, very slowly, to unclench. That's the part of this story that still gets me looking back. Not the violence, not even the rescue itself. It was watching someone who'd been rescued 11 days earlier become, almost instinctively, the person doing the rescuing on the emotional side of things for someone rescued 11 days later. Like the kindness was contagious. Like it had a half-life that kept extending outward, person to person, long after the soldiers who'd started it had moved on to the next signal in the dark. It was 2 days after that second group of survivors arrived that I finally got the rest of the story. The part Calder hadn't told me on the transport. The part that explained why his unit looked the particular kind of grim they looked when they came back from that second rescue. I found him in the common hall late one evening, alone, sitting near the windows with the gas giant's amber light catching the lines on his face. He looked older than I remembered him looking on Calyx Station, though it had only been 13 days. "You found another one," I said, sitting down a respectful distance away. Not a question. By then I understood that's mostly what these missions were, finding, again and again, the next desperate signal in the dark. "Found the source," he said. "Not just another holding pen, the hub." I didn't fully understand what he meant. Not yet, so I waited. "The Skarn don't run these transport routes randomly," he said. "Calyx Station, the one we hit, that was a transfer point. A way station. There's a command ship behind it, coordinating maybe a dozen routes like yours, moving people through 6 or 7 systems before they ever reach an actual market. We've been tracking the network for months, piecing together transfer logs, trying to find the actual source instead of just chasing individual transports one at a time." He rubbed a hand over his face. "We found it, 3 days ago. A command vessel called the Hesker's Dew, anchored in a debris field they're using for cover, out past a dead system nobody bothers to chart. And you went after it." "We did." His jaw tightened. "It wasn't like Calyx. They knew we existed by then. Word travels, even among slavers, especially among slavers, because slavers depend on knowing which routes are safe. They'd reinforced. Real defenses this time, not just stun batons and crowd control." I felt something cold settle in my stomach. "Did anyone?" "Lost one," he said quietly. "Sansetti, demolition specialist, good man, 3 years with the unit." He didn't elaborate further, and I understood, the way I'd understood with Priya's silences, that some weight wasn't mine to ask him to set down in front of me. "We got the survivors out. 43 people, including that boy your friend's looking after. We also got the Hesker's Dew's full logistics database before the ship went down. Every route, every way station, every system they've been running people through for the last 6 years." "What happens to that?" Calder looked at me, and for the first time since I'd met him, something that wasn't tiredness moved across his face. Something colder, harder, more purposeful. "It happens to every Skarn operation on every route in that database," he said. "Simultaneously, if we can manage it. We're not going station to station anymore, hopping we get lucky and hear another signal before it's too late. We know the whole network now, every Calyx station they've got." I won't pretend I understood in that moment the full scale of what he was describing. It took weeks, months even, piecing it together from fragments. Some from Priya, some from station broadcasts that started reaching us once we'd recovered enough to care about news from outside our own small recovery. Some from survivors of later rescues who arrived at the station with their own pieces of the larger picture. What I eventually understood was this. The Hesker's Dues logistics database didn't just expose one trafficking route. It exposed the entire architecture the Skarn Compact had built over more than a decade to move captured people from a few dozen quiet, undefended systems toward markets scattered across a third of the explored galaxy. Calder's people, Earth, and whatever alliance of smaller species had slowly gathered around them in the years since they'd started answering distress signals nobody else would, took that database and didn't sit on it. They moved. Not all at once, not as cleanly as the stories that circulated later made it sound, but over the following months, one Skarn way station after another got hit by the same pattern. Ships dropping in without warning, guards who'd built their whole operational doctrine around the assumption that nobody capable of stopping them was paying attention, suddenly discovering that the assumption had expired. Some stations surrendered without a fight once they understood what they were facing. A few didn't, and those didn't end well for anyone wearing Skarn colors, though I noticed when the stories reached us that the body count among the rescued was always reported in careful, specific detail, and the body count among the slavers themselves was almost never dwelt on at all, not out of cruelty, I came to understand, but because Calder's people genuinely didn't seem interested in keeping score on that side of the ledger. They weren't doing this for vengeance. They were doing it because the math had to change, and once it started changing, it didn't stop until it was finished. The Skarn Compact didn't collapse overnight. Empires built on a decade of confident harvesting don't unwind in a season, but something fundamental broke in their operating assumptions, and it broke specifically because of a signal sent by a man named Das Enrethi from a relay station that no longer exists into a frequency nobody believed anyone would ever check again. I think about Das Enrethi often, even now, 8 years later. I never found out what happened to him, whether he survived the initial raid, whether he ever knew his signal reached anyone, whether he died believing he'd thrown his last hour away on a hopeless gesture into an empty dark. I asked, eventually, through the slow channels that opened up once our system began the long process of rebuilding under the loose protection of the alliance that had formed around Earth's example. The records were incomplete. Most of the orbital ring's personnel records were incomplete, scattered, half destroyed in the raid. His name appears on a list of confirmed casualties from that first day, but the list itself carries a note that some names on it were later found alive in transport records, misfiled, miscounted, the bureaucratic chaos of an invasion leaving its own quiet wreckage in paperwork that took years to untangle. I choose to believe he didn't survive, not because I want that to be true, but because I think there's something important in sitting with the fact that he might have died never knowing whether his signal did anything at all. That's the part of bravery people don't like to dwell on in the version of this story that gets told at gatherings, years later, with everyone safe and fed and the worst of it behind them. Real bravery, the kind that actually changes anything, usually happens without the guarantee of ever finding out if it mattered. Das Enrethi sent a signal into the dark with no reason to believe anyone was listening, and the not knowing, I think, is part of what makes it brave instead of just lucky. He never got to see what his signal started. He never got to stand in that warm common hall on the relief station and watch a woman named Vethka cross a room to crouch in front of a stranger's son because she recognized the exact shape of his fear. He never got to hear Calder's tired voice telling 300 frightened strangers, plainly, without any flourish, that somebody had finally heard them. But it started with him. Whatever else gets told about this, the dramatic ceiling breach, the soldiers who fell from the sky in total silence, the slow unraveling of an empire built on the confident assumption that no one was coming. None of it happens without one ordinary man deciding, in his worst hour, that silence was a worse bet than a signal nobody might ever answer. I left the relief station 9 months after the rescue. Most of us did eventually, once the slow business of figuring out where home even meant any more had sorted itself into something like answers. Some went back to what was left of our system, to help with the rebuilding that Earth's alliance had committed resources toward, not as charity exactly, but as something closer to an apology that understood actions mattered more than words. Some, like Vethka, chose to stay closer to the relief network itself, working in whatever capacity they could to help the next wave of survivors find their footing the way she'd helped that frightened young Doroth boy find his. I went back. I won't pretend the system I returned to was the one I'd left. Whole coastal cities had been stripped during the raid, and rebuilding a lattice city that breathes with the tide takes more than 9 months, takes more, probably, than the rest of my lifetime. But it was ours again, in the ways that mattered, and there's something in rebuilding something broken that I hadn't understood before I had to do it myself. A particular, stubborn kind of hope that doesn't ask permission from circumstance, that just gets up every day and does the next small necessary thing. I saw Calder one more time, about 2 years after Calyx Station, when his unit passed through our system on a supply run, and he took an afternoon to walk through the parts of the coastal city that had been rebuilt. He looked the same, tired in that specific, permanent way, like the tiredness had become a feature of his face rather than a passing state. But there was something else there too, something I hadn't seen on the transport that first day. Something that looked almost like quiet satisfaction, the kind that comes not from a job finished, because the job was never going to be finished, not really, but from a job still being done, day after day, system after system, signal after signal. "You rebuilt the relay tower," he said, looking up at the new structure rising over the harbor, the one we'd named, without much discussion needed, after a relay administrator named Das and Rethi who'd never got to see what his last signal started. "We did," I said. He was quiet for a long moment, studying the tower, the harbor. The lattice city, slowly breathing back into something like its old rhythm around us. "Good," he said finally. "Somebody should always be listening. That's the whole of it, as much as I can tell it. Not a story about chosen ones or grand destinies, because that's not what it was. It was a man named Das and Rethi who refused to let silence be the last thing he offered the universe. It was a species that had learned its own hard lessons about loss and decided, collectively and stubbornly, that no signal would go unanswered again if they had any say in it. It was tired soldiers falling through a ceiling in dead silence, not because they wanted glory, but because somewhere far away, somebody had finally heard a scream in the dark and refused to let it go unanswered. The Skarn thought no one was coming. They'd built an entire empire on that confident, comfortable math, that distance and quiet and the absence of a navy meant permanent safety for anyone willing to do the harvesting. They were wrong, not because the universe owes anyone rescue, and not because justice arrives on a schedule anyone can count on. They were wrong because somewhere out past the edge of what anyone thought mattered, a small, grieving, stubborn species had quietly decided that the old math was unacceptable, and they intended to keep proving it wrong, one answered signal at a time, for as long as it took. I think about that every time I look up at the rebuilt relay tower over the harbor. Somebody is still listening. Somebody will always be listening now. And that, more than anything else this story holds, is the part I hope people remember.